Throughout the 18th century, scientific and technological advancements ushered in the Industrial Revolution, which radically altered the nature of previously agrarian communities all across the world, particularly in Europe and North America. The advent of new machinery and techniques led to new methods of mass production of goods. Industries such as textiles, iron making, and other sectors, which once relied on workers, transitioned to machines, and this resulted in the ginormous change which we now know as the First Industrial Revolution. A few inventions were made in the 1700s, but the real beginning of the Industrial Revolution was in Britain in the 1830s and 1840s, and it quickly expanded to the rest of the world, including the United States. Historians of the modern era often refer to this period as the First Industrial Revolution to differentiate it from the second period of industrialization, which occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and was characterized by rapid advances in the steel, electric, and automobile industries. Britain has a long history of producing textiles like wool, linen, and cotton in part because its moist climate is good for breeding sheep. But before the Industrial Revolution, the British textile sector was a genuine cottage industry, with workers spinning, weaving, and dyeing cloth in their own homes or tiny workshops. Inventions including the spinning jenny, a wooden frame with many spindles, the flying shuttle, water frame, and power loom, appeared around the middle of the 18th century, simplifying the processes of weaving cloth and spinning yarn and thread. The production of fabric accelerated, required much less human work, and took much less time. While the British Empire's many overseas colonies provided a captive market for its goods, the country's new textile factories began meeting the rising domestic and international demand for fabric because of their increased efficiency and mechanized production. Nonetheless, Britain's textile industry was not the only sector that embraced change. Britain's ironworks transformed as well in the use of coke, a product of burning coal, in place of charcoal in the iron ore smelting process, was a major innovation of this era. As a result of the increased demand spurred by the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815 and the subsequent development of the railroad sector, Britain's iron and steel demand had risen. But due to the production increase thanks to this cheaper and more effective process, the country easily coped with it. In the early 1700s, a symbol of the Industrial Revolution appeared on the scene: Thomas Newcomen's design for the first modern steam engine. Newcomen's innovation, the atmospheric steam engine, was initially employed to operate the pumps that removed water from mine shafts. James Watt, a Scottish engineer, began improving upon one of Newcomen's models in the 1760s by adding a water condenser. This greatly increased the device's efficiency. Later, Watt worked with Matthew Boulton to develop a rotary motion steam engine, a pivotal development that facilitated the widespread use of steam power across a variety of British industries, including mills for producing grain, paper, and cotton, as well as iron, alcohol, and water. Coal was essential to the operation of steam engines, and the use of steam power enabled miners to access greater depths in order to obtain more of this inexpensive energy source. Since coal was required to power not just the factories that produced manufactured products, but also the railroads and steamships that transported them, demand for coal skyrocketed throughout the Industrial Revolution and beyond. By 1815, Britain had more than 2,000 miles of canals in service, and its road system, which had been quite basic before industrialization, had seen significant improvements. Richard Trevithick introduced the first steam-powered locomotive in the early 1800s, and by 1830, similar locomotives were hauling goods and people between the major manufacturing centers of Manchester and Liverpool. Ships and boats powered by steam engines were already widely used to transport products along Britain's rivers and canals and across the Atlantic at that point. Adam Smith, a Scottish social philosopher and the progenitor of modern economics, released his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. In it, Smith argued for a market economy in which private property of the means of production and minimal government regulation are privileged. During this time, a new class of wealthy individuals, bankers, and industrial financiers emerged, as did a factory system depending on individual owners and managers. It wasn't until the 1770s that London had its own stock exchange, and it wasn't until the 1790s that New York got its own. When the need for effective long-distance communication became more apparent, significant breakthroughs in communication systems were made at the end of the Industrial Revolution. While American scientists like Samuel Morse were hard at work on their own telegraphy systems, British inventors William Cooke and Charles Wheatstone patented the first commercial system in 1837. Since the new steam-powered trains ran much faster than their predecessors, a more sophisticated system, like Cook and Wheatstone's, was needed for railroad signaling. Many Britons had already begun migrating to cities from the countryside before the Industrial Revolution, but this trend picked up speed as the growth of massive factories gradually transformed smaller towns into a major metropolis. Overpopulation, poor infrastructure, substandard living conditions, and a shortage of potable water are only some of the negative outcomes of this trend towards urbanization. Even though industrialization raised the standard of living for the middle and higher classes and boosted economic output generally, the poor and working classes continued to face challenges. Many people, including children, were obliged to work long hours for meager earnings, since the mechanization of labor, brought about by technological advancement, had made factory work more tiresome and occasionally dangerous. The Luddites, infamous for their violent opposition to reforms in Britain's textile industry, were just one example of the widespread backlash against industrialization that these kinds of disruptions and abuses sparked. Labor unions, new child labor laws, and public health restrictions were all passed in the United Kingdom and the United States in the decades after the advent of industrialization in response to widespread public outcry over the plight of the working class and the impoverished. The opening of an English immigrants' textile mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, in 1793 is generally considered to mark the commencement of industrialization in the United States. Despite regulations forbidding the emigration of textile workers, Slater smuggled Arkwright's ideas over the Atlantic after working at one of the mills constructed by the creator of the waterframe, Richard Arkwright. His success with these cotton mills led to his being dubbed the father of the American Industrial Revolution, and he went on to construct numerous more in New England. Inspired by developments stolen from Britain and by indigenous inventors like Eli Whitney, the United States went its own way on the road to industrialization. The cotton gin or cotton engine was Eli Whitney's revolutionary innovation of 1793, and it strengthened the hold of slavery over the cotton-producing South. The United States underwent a similar shift, from an agrarian culture to an increasingly urban one, and by the middle of the 19th century, the industry had spread over Western Europe and the northeastern United States. The United States surpassed all other countries in industrial output by the turn of the 20th century. Despite this, several aspects of industrialization remain controversial among historians, which include its precise date, the reasons for its early onset in Britain rather than elsewhere, and the possibility that it was more of a progressive progression than a revolutionary change. Nonetheless, both the advantages and disadvantages of the Industrial Revolution are intricate. While industrialization brought about the prevalence of unsafe working conditions and environmental degradation due to the use of coal and gas, the urbanization of human societies and the innovative technologies that lowered the costs of transportation, communication, and clothing fundamentally altered the trajectory of human history as well. Notwithstanding these uncertainties, it is undeniable that the Industrial Revolution was crucial to the development of modern society and had far-reaching effects in the realms of economics, culture, and politics than anyone had initially estimated. How significant do you think the Industrial Revolution was in world history? Tell us in the comments below. This brings us to the end of this video. If you like the video, please consider subscribing and sharing so we can keep bringing more content like this. See you next time.